and I'm still at UGA, teaching and writing philosophy. I'm also a union member, a member of the Communication Workers of America, organizing Local 3265, which is attempting to organize all employees in the state university system. I ran 2 years ago for the U.S. House of Representatives as a Democrat in the 10th Congressional District, a little bit south of this one. Slightly less challenging for a Democrat. You know, the voting tends to go 2/3 Republican. And I experienced, I think, what Democratic candidates experience is when they're in non-metro areas, heavily gerrymandered districts that have a supermajority of Republicans. You know, one can ideally have a chance to change the mind of the electorate, but one needs to have the opportunity to be able to get one's existence known to them, and more than one's existence, one's policies. But the media has almost evaporated in our regions. Broadband does not penetrate everywhere. Very few people want to help a Democrat in these parts. But after going back to the ivory tower, I felt things are not getting any better. And we are really at a turning point as this year approaches. And we need to make this nation righteous before it's too late, and righteous in the true sense of fulfilling all of our rights, and in particular, the social rights that have been neglected from the very beginning of our republic. Because even though our Constitution gives us certain political rights, certain civil rights, which of course have taken 2 centuries to be consistently recognized and realized, the achievement of a consistent application of those rights still shows that they are not sufficient to overcome the tremendous disadvantage that afflicts people by race, by gender, and by economic circumstances. And as one of our greatest Democrats recognized in his final address to Congress, I'm talking of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1944, when the Allies were on the verge of defeating fascism and defending successfully the freedoms that we had, he recognized that these freedoms were not enough, were not sufficient to allow for the pursuit of happiness in the modern world. We needed, he said, a new Bill of Rights. The rights that pertain to our social freedoms, our right to have a job at a fair wage, our right to have decent union representation, our right to have decent housing, our right to have health care, our right to have access to education at all levels, our right to have legal representation at all levels, our right to have access to culture of all kinds. But his message fell on deaf ears. It was renewed, as I think we all know, by Martin Luther King in his last year after the triumph of the civil rights movement. But he pointed out that if you do not have a job and income, you have neither life, liberty, nor the pursuit of happiness. And so he launched his Poor People's Campaign, which renewed the call for a new social Bill of Rights. Again, it fell on deaf ears. Here we are, half a century later. You know, a nation in which racial and gender disadvantage remains entrenched, where we have become the most unequal nation in the developed world, where we have less social mobility than any other developed nation, and where we are facing an upsurge of an anti-democratic nationalism that is threatening democracy here at home and abroad. And meanwhile, we are facing an advancing climate catastrophe without taking any actions that are sufficient. And although I'm not going to deny that Democrats in power have been better than Republicans, they have not taken the measures necessary to overcome the entrenched racial and gender disadvantage, to prevent the advancing disempowerment of labor, to prevent the increasing inequality in wealth and equality, to do anything sufficient to address the climate change that we are suffering, and to do anything sufficient to stave off what really is a increasing, I have to say one has to call it a fascist threat to democracy the world over. So I'm here to bring the fight to Washington for the fulfillment of the social rights that we have ignored at our own peril. And the social right that is really at the base of the fulfillment of all the others is the true right to work, the right to have a job at a fair wage. Because without that, one cannot have any economic independence and security. Even if one is attempting to be among that small minority of Americans who make a living not as an employee, but as an entrepreneur or a landlord, we all know that if you don't make it, you have one thing to rely upon now that slavery has been abolished: your ownership of your labor power and to be an employee. Now, the market can never be counted on to provide full employment. We need to have a federal job guarantee where the government steps in as an employer of last resort, puts to work anyone who wants the job, who is an adult and willing, and to do the kind of things that are not going to compete with the private sector, but to provide the goods and services we need. And I can tell you from being a candidate who went through all 25 counties of the 10th district, there are many goods and services that are badly needed in our region and everywhere in America. Our infrastructure is in very dilapidated shape. We need to make the transition to a green economy and put an end to fossil fuel consumption and production by 2030. And we can put people to work doing that. We need to refurbish all of our public facilities and services and give aid and services to our health installations, to our schools, and bring the arts to the public. And we can make use of all of the talents of anyone who is looking for employment. And even in an age where employment is thought by some to be at an historical low of maybe 3 or 4%, that's still 5 million people in our country. And there are at least as many people who have part-time employment, who want full-time employment, and many more who are in the so-called gig economy with 0-hour contingent jobs, who are struggling, who would like to have a full-time job, and many more who simply dropped out. Now, this is transformative for those who are struggling to find work. We cannot shut down the school-to-prison pipeline without a federal job guarantee. We cannot put the brakes on mass incarceration without a federal job guarantee, so that everyone knows they have a job awaiting them where they can legally earn a decent living and contribute to their community. But it's also transformative for all of us who have employment, because it lifts the fear of firing, which puts a damper on our ability to fight for our rights against sexual harassment, against racial disadvantage, against all sorts of abuses by employers. And of course, it's good for the economy. It provides maximum consumer demand. It shields us from business cycles, ups and downs. And it also is something that is crucial to make the kind of transitions we have to do. We can't have a Green New Deal unless we can ensure everyone whose livelihood depends upon fossil fuel consumption and production that they will have guaranteed jobs at fair wages awaiting them. We can't have Medicare for all, as we need to have if we're going to have our right to health care enforced, unless we can ensure everyone in the private insurance industry and all that bloated staff of people in doctors' offices who have to deal with this multiplicity of insurance plans unnecessarily, we have to ensure that they have a livelihood. The same thing applies to being able to have comprehensive immigration reform. We have to ensure that when we give legal status to the undocumented, that no one's livelihood will be in jeopardy. And the same thing applies actually to having genuine reproductive freedom, because that doesn't just involve being able to have an abortion. Of course, we need Medicare for all covering abortions so that people can afford to have an abortion if they're going to have an abortion. But we also have to ensure that people can afford to have the children they want. And for that to be the case, we have to ensure that everyone has a job at a fair wage. We also have to balance work and family. We have to ensure, for example, that there is paid leave, paid 9-month parental leave, that there is free public child and elder care, that there are 9-month, $900 monthly child allowances to wipe out childhood poverty, With that, then we can say that parents, and women in particular, will not find any conflict confronting them between advancing their career and ensuring that their families can be taken care of. Now, we Democrats pretend to be the friends of minorities and labor, but frankly, since the Wagner Act was passed, we've done very little to really do anything to prevent the advancing disempowerment of labor and to level the playing field between labor and management. I think we all know that unionization is at an all-time low. It's 6% in the private sector, 10.5% overall. And that signifies that, generally speaking, we are all alone, at least 90% of us are alone, on our own, facing our employers, facing firing at will. We need to change that situation. And we can do it with two important measures. One is to have automatic elections in every enterprise with multiple employees, be they part-timers, full-timers, contract employees, gig employees, so that we employees, who make up 95% of breadwinners in America, can stand on an equal footing with employers. We also need to reserve 50% of the seats on corporate boards for employees elected by their peers, so that no more will there be CEO super salaries and golden parachutes and transfers of jobs overseas without any input on the part of employees, etc. We can transform things from within in a fundamental way. And we have to keep in mind that when we speak about a fair wage, we're not talking about something that I'm afraid many Democrats speak of, which is a living wage. A living wage at $15 an hour is a poverty wage and an invitation to homelessness, because according to the government's own figures, in no American city can you afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment, let alone a two-bedroom apartment, if you make $15 an hour. So we need to have a fair wage, and a fair wage in two senses. First, it has to start at least $20 an hour. So you can afford to live in a decent house, a decent apartment. But we also have to ensure that all wages rise as our national wealth increases, so that we keep pace with the rising prosperity of the nation, so that wages are adjusted not only with inflation, but with productivity gains. And that means we start at over $20 an hour. And if we want to wipe out not just unemployment, but poverty wages, but also poverty income for everyone, we need to ensure that the disabled and retirees do not live on the poverty incomes provided by Social Security, which are $1,200 per month if you're disabled, $1,400 per month on average if you're retired, neither of which is enough to live decently. Instead, those rates should equal what a fair minimum wage should be, which comes to, I think, if we start at $20 an hour, $41,600 a year. Now with this, we eliminate poverty. We eliminate unemployment. We set the stage where we can make our public schools work, because our kids no longer have poverty dragging them down. But we need to have national funding of our public education to ensure that every child gets a fair share of resources, and those who are most in need get exactly what they need. We have to raise teacher salaries. We have to ensure that everyone has access to post-secondary education. That requires not only that public institutions of post-secondary education have no tuition, but that we provide stipends for students, because it's not enough not to pay tuition. You need to have something to live on if you're going to be a full-time student. That is provided in Europe. We need to do the same. And with regard to our housing crisis, if everyone has a fair income, we can ban all foreclosures, all evictions, all utility turnoffs, and require mandatory rescheduling of payments. And with a federal job guarantee, we can ensure that enough units of low-cost housing are built. Now finally, the capstone of these parts of a social bill of rights is something on which all of the others depend, and that is providing the resources for everyone to defend their rights in court before the law. Our Constitution only gives us a guarantee of legal representation in criminal cases. And the way it's handled, with public defenders, pro bono handouts from private law firms, and court-appointed lawyers, is that those who have to rely upon these kinds of legal aid are getting the short end of the stick. Their legal resources are much more restricted, their caseloads are much higher, and it's no accident that in our country, 95% of criminal cases are plea bargained. That is the highway to mass incarceration. And for civil cases, where we defend ourselves against sexual harassment, racial discrimination, problems on the job, problems with landlords, problems with family matters, with custody and so forth, we have no guarantee of representation. So we need a legal care for all program, like the Medicare for All program that we need to ensure that health care is a right. And what this means, you go to any lawyer you want for personal, civil, or criminal cases, and the fees are negotiated nationally, and they're paid for by a publicly subsidized insurance fund, just like Medicare for All. Then we can all have the dream team we need. Then we can have all of our rights properly defended. This involves a recipe for a new birth of freedom, a way of making our nation truly righteous, of really fulfilling what is the true American dream. Now, this is what I hope to bring to Washington. I hope that this platform becomes something that other candidates will carry on. I think it's something that the Democratic Party should be adopting. And in doing so, it's not turning away from its heritage. It's turning back in many respects to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt put forward back in 1944. Take a look at my campaign website, winfieldforsenate.com. That's also spelled out F-O-R, W-I-N-F-I-E-L-D, F-O-R, Senate.com. I need your help. I don't have a father like Matthew Lieberman, through whose contacts I can raise $1 million. I'm certainly not the darling of certain parts of the Democratic establishment. Will ensure that I have plenty of money to run a campaign. I will have to get by on grassroots donations. The race I'm in has two great advantages. Well, three advantages. First of all, it goes on all the way till November. I have time to build. There's no gerrymandering to deal with. As we all know, the numbers of Democrats and Republicans is getting very equal. It's very, very competitive. No vote will be wasted. And I spent many years in the 10th district feeling that my vote was wasted. But this is a race where no vote is wasted. And there hopefully will be press coverage. So go to my website. I need volunteers. I need the word to be spread. I need any of my social media posts to be shared and retweeted. And I need donations. And I would like to hear questions, because one thing I experienced as a candidate is that there's a tendency in our party to not have much debate about what we stand for. And I'm happy to say that my experience here is very different from what I experienced in many other county meetings where I'm given 5 minutes, sometimes only 2 minutes to speak, followed by no discussion. And that's not good for the party. No. That's a situation where we're left with a politics in which money is going to determine what the voters hear. Because whoever has the most money will have the more sound bites coming out of the TV and elsewhere. And nothing else will be heard by the public. But we need to debate the issues. We need to discuss concrete policies. And I hope you will engage in that as well. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll throw a question out.
Yeah.
I was having a discussion just this weekend with my favorite Republican, and we're talking about how I believe